Have you ever felt the ground beneath your feet shift so subtly, so gradually, that you didn't realize you were standing on unsteady earth until the tremors became undeniable? Have you ever looked at someone you've known your entire life, someone as familiar as your own reflection, and suddenly seen a stranger staring back? This is a story about those unsettling shifts, those slow burns of realization that can unravel the very fabric of our closest relationships. It's a story that's deeply personal, a confession, if you will, and it's one I share with a heavy heart, hoping it might resonate, might offer a cautionary whisper in the whirlwind of life's complexities. My name is David, and this is the story of how the innocent affection I shared with my daughter, Emily, began to twist into something else. It was late summer, that cusp between the fiery days of August and the mellowing embrace of September. The sun, lower in the sky than it had been just weeks before, cast long languid shadows that painted the suburban streets in hues of amber and rose. Inside our home, a quiet Friday evening was unfolding. The air conditioner hummed a gentle, monotonous tune, a counterpoint to the soft jazz drifting from the radio in the kitchen. I was there, lost in the rhythm of chopping vegetables, the familiar scent of garlic and onions filling the air, promising a comforting meal. Emily was home. She'd just driven in from college, a small liberal arts school a couple of hours away, and the house felt fuller. Not just in the physical sense but energetically. Her presence, even unseen, seemed to amplify everything. I smiled to myself. It had been too quiet without her. College had been her dream, and I'd encouraged her every step of the way, but the silence her absence left behind was a constant, low-grade ache. When I heard her car pull into the driveway earlier, a wave of warmth had washed over me. I'd peeked out the window, and there she was, unfolding herself from her slightly battered sedan, looking impossibly grown up. Gone was the gangly teenager I dropped off just a few months prior. In her place stood a young woman poised and self-assured, her movements carrying a new kind of grace. It was a proud moment, undeniably, but mixed with a peculiar pang of something. Loss, maybe? A wistful longing for the simpler days when she was still my little girl, constantly under my wing. "Dinner's almost ready," I called out, my voice perhaps a little too loud in the otherwise still house. "Coming, Dad," she responded, her voice lighter, more melodic than I remembered. She walked into the kitchen and I turned, spatula in hand, to greet her. And that's when I first noticed it. The way she looked at me. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but there was a depth, an intensity in her gaze that I couldn't immediately decipher. Her eyes lingered a beat too long, tracing the lines around my eyes, the slight graying at my temples. It wasn't the casual, affectionate look of a daughter for her father. It felt different, intimate in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. I blinked, forcing a smile. "Hey you, how was the drive?" I asked, turning back to the stove, needing to break the intensity of that gaze, needing to occupy myself with something mundane. "Long but good. Campus is already buzzing for fall semester." She leaned against the kitchen counter, watching me. "Smells amazing, Dad. What are you making?" Her voice was warm, engaging, perfectly normal. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe it was just fatherly oversensitivity, reading too much into a simple look. I told myself to relax, to not let my anxieties run away with me. Dinner was a comfortable affair. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Emily had done her homework, played board games, spilled juice boxes, and confessed childhood crushes. The familiar setting should have been reassuring, but that subtle undercurrent from before was still there, buzzing beneath the surface of our conversation. We talked about her classes, about her friends, about the chaotic energy of college life. She recounted a funny anecdote about her roommate's disastrous attempt at baking cookies, and I found myself laughing, genuinely enjoying her company. But even as we laughed, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching me more than she was engaging with the conversation. Her eyes would drift to my face, linger, then flick away as if she were suddenly conscious of being too forward. Once, as I reached for the water pitcher, her hand brushed mine on the table. It was a fleeting touch, accidental, easily dismissed, but the sensation that shot through me wasn't fleeting at all. It was sharp, electric, and undeniably charged. I recoiled slightly, pulling my hand back perhaps a little too abruptly. "Everything okay, Dad?" she asked, her brow furrowing with concern. Yeah, just a little clumsy tonight, I stammered, feeling a flush creep up my neck. I busied myself refilling my glass, avoiding her gaze. After dinner, she suggested a movie night. Remember how we used to do that every Friday? She said, her eyes lighting up with a nostalgic sparkle. Of course I remembered. Friday movie nights were our ritual. A sacred tradition when Emily was younger. We'd pile onto the couch, blankets and popcorn in tow, and lose ourselves in fantastical worlds or heartwarming comedies. It had been years since we'd done that, since college had claimed her weekends and our rhythms had shifted. Sounds great, I agreed, trying to inject enthusiasm into my voice, even though a knot of unease was tightening in my stomach. We settled into the living room. I dimmed the lights, creating that cozy cinematic atmosphere we used to cherish. We chose a classic movie, a feel-good story we both loved from her childhood. As the opening credits rolled, I tried to relax, to sink into the familiar comfort of the moment. But the comfort was elusive. The living room did feel cozier than usual, the dim lighting casting soft shadows, the plush cushions inviting us to sink deeper into the couch. And Emily was closer. Much closer than she needed to be to see the television screen. Our knees were almost touching. As the movie played, my attention drifted away from the screen and towards her. I found myself stealing glances, drawn to her in a way that felt both natural and wrong. Her profile was sharper now, more defined. The soft curve of her cheek, the delicate line of her jaw. She was no longer a girl. She was undeniably a woman. A beautiful woman. My daughter. The thought hit me with the force of a physical blow. My daughter. And yet, in that dim light, in that close proximity, my mind was betraying me, conjuring thoughts and feelings that were inappropriate. Unthinkable. It was then, as if responding to the unspoken turmoil within me, that she shifted. Just a small movement, a subtle slide across the cushions. But it was enough. Her shoulder brushed mine. Then her arm. And then slowly, deliberately, her hand moved. It wasn't an accident this time. Her hand wasn't reaching for popcorn. Wasn't adjusting her blanket. It was reaching for me. Her fingers grazed mine. A feather-light touch that sent a jolt of electricity up my arm. It wasn't just electric. It was magnetic. Like two opposing charges inexplicably drawn together. A wave of panic washed over me. This was wrong. So fundamentally, so deeply wrong. The air in the room seemed to thicken, heavy with unspoken desires and forbidden longings. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that I had to stop this. Now. I snatched my hand back as if burned, my movement jerky and too sudden. The abruptness of it seemed to echo in the quiet living room, amplified by the humming of the air conditioner and the muted dialogue from the movie. "What's wrong, Dad?" she asked again, her voice softer this time, laced with a fragile worry. Her eyes, wide and questioning, searched mine. I looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the innocent child I still carried in my memory, but this grown woman, her gaze holding a depth of emotion that both intrigued and terrified me. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of alarm. Words caught in my throat, strangled by the weight of what I was feeling, what I feared she might be feeling too. "Nothing, baby," I managed to croak out, my voice sounding strained and unnatural even to my own ears. "Just tired. Long day at work." It was a pathetic excuse, transparently false, but it was all I could muster. I forced a weak smile, hoping to mask the turmoil raging within me, praying she wouldn't see the truth in my eyes, wouldn't sense the tremor in my hands. But I knew deep down that something had irrevocably shifted in that moment. The invisible line, the sacred boundary between father and daughter, had blurred, smudged by a touch, a look, an unspoken longing. We hadn't crossed it, not yet, but the air between us was now thick with unspoken thoughts, dangerous possibilities. We sat in silence after that, the movie flickering on the screen, a meaningless backdrop to the silent storm brewing in the room. Neither of us spoke, neither of us moved. The comfortable intimacy of our movie nights, once so cherished, had been shattered, replaced by a tense, suffocating awareness of each other, of the forbidden space that had opened between us. Finally, I couldn't bear it any longer. The silence was suffocating, the unspoken tension crackling in the air. I stood up abruptly, my movement stiff and unnatural. I should get to bed," I mumbled, avoiding her gaze. "Early start tomorrow." "Okay, Dad," she said quietly, her voice subdued. She didn't try to stop me, didn't question my sudden departure. She just watched me, her eyes shadowed and unreadable in the dim light. As I retreated to my bedroom, closing the door behind me with a soft click that felt deafening in the silence of the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed between us. Something precious had been fractured. Lying in bed that night, sleep evaded me. My mind raced, replaying the evening's events, each glance, each touch, each loaded silence looping endlessly in my thoughts. I knew I had to create distance. For both our sakes. I had to reestablish the boundaries, to rebuild the wall that had somehow begun to crumble. But even as I made that resolution, a chilling doubt whispered in the back of my mind. Was it already too late? Had the seed of something forbidden already been sown? Continue the story, adding details to the next morning and the walk. The morning dawned gray and overcast, mirroring the somber mood that clung to me like a shroud. Sleep had been a restless, fractured affair, punctuated by fragmented dreams and a persistent, gnawing anxiety. The events of the previous night replayed in my mind with relentless clarity, each moment, each sensation magnified and distorted by the prism of my fear. I tried to convince myself it was all a misinterpretation. I was her father. Nothing more, nothing less. My love for her was paternal, pure. Any other interpretation was a grotesque aberration of my own troubled mind. I was being unreasonable, overreacting. It was just a clumsy touch, a daughter seeking connection after being away. Nothing more. But the insistent voice of denial felt hollow, unconvincing even to myself. The memory of her gaze, the electric charge of her hand on mine, the raw, unspoken emotion in the air. These were not figments of my imagination. They were real. And they were terrifying. Dragging myself out of bed, I felt drained, emotionally and physically depleted. The thought of facing Emily, of navigating the strained atmosphere between us, filled me with dread. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to go through the motions of my morning routine, hoping to project an air of normalcy, even if it was a fragile facade. When I came downstairs, the house was quiet. Too quiet. The usual morning bustle was absent. No clatter of dishes, no murmur of the news from the kitchen radio. Emily was already up, sitting at the kitchen table, a book open in front of her. She looked up as I entered and a faint, almost hesitant smile touched her lips. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft, almost neutral, devoid of the warmth and energy it had held just the day before. "Good morning," I replied, trying to match her tone, to sound as casual and unaffected as possible. "Sleep okay?" Pathetic small talk. "Yeah, fine," she answered, her eyes flicking back down to her book, a worn paperback with a slightly dog-eared cover. The air between us was thick with unspoken tension, a palpable barrier that neither of us seemed willing to breach. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the rich aroma filling the silence, a small comfort in the otherwise unsettling atmosphere. "I was thinking of going for a walk later," Emily said suddenly, her voice breaking the heavy silence. She still didn't look up from her book. Would you like to join me? It's been a while since we've done anything together." Her words hung in the air, a tentative olive branch, an attempt to bridge the chasm that had opened between us. My initial instinct was to refuse, to create distance, to avoid any further opportunity for whatever that unsettling connection was between us. But then another part of me, a desperate, yearning part, felt a pull towards her, a longing to recapture the ease and affection we used to share. Maybe a walk in the fresh air, a return to familiar routines, would help dispel the darkness that had settled over us. Maybe it would be a way to gently, subtly reestablish the boundaries, to remind us both of who we were to each other. Father and daughter. Nothing more. I hesitated for a moment, weighing the risks and the potential rewards, my mind a battlefield of conflicting emotions. But in the end, the longing for normalcy, the hope of repairing what felt broken, won out. "Sure," I replied, trying to infuse my voice with a warmth I didn't entirely feel. "Sounds nice." Later that afternoon, we drove in silence to a park a short drive from our house. It was a place steeped in memories, a landscape of shared childhood moments. Emily and I had walked these paths countless times when she was little, her small hand nestled in mine, her bright laughter echoing through the trees. We'd chased squirrels, picnicked on the grassy slopes, and watched boats drift lazily across the small lake at the park's heart. The park was beautiful that day. The air was crisp and clean, washed clean by a recent rain. The sky, though still overcast, held a soft, diffused light. For a fleeting moment, as we stepped out of the car and onto the familiar path, everything felt almost normal. We started walking side by side, the silence between us less strained now, softened by the familiar surroundings. We talked, tentatively at first, about inconsequential things: the weather, the changing leaves, the overly enthusiastic dog walkers we passed on the path. Gradually, the conversation loosened, flowing into more personal territory. We reminisced about old family vacations, laughed at shared memories, and even touched lightly on her college life, carefully avoiding any topic that felt too raw, too close to the unspoken tension simmering beneath the surface. I found myself smiling more, genuinely enjoying her company, feeling a flicker of the old, comfortable affection rekindle in my heart. Maybe I had overreacted the night before. Maybe it was just a passing sensitivity, a momentary lapse in judgment on my part. Maybe this walk, this return to normalcy, would be enough to reset everything, to push back the darkness and restore the light to our relationship. But as we walked deeper into the park, the initial ease began to dissipate. The conversation faltered, punctuated by longer and longer silences. These silences weren't comfortable, companionable silences. They were heavy, laden with unspoken thoughts and feelings, stretching on, heavier than they should have been. The air around us seeming to thicken with each passing moment. The cheerful chatter of other parkgoers, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, the distant splash of water from the lake. All these sounds seemed muted, muffled by the weight of the unspoken tension between us. At one point, we reached a clearing overlooking a wide expanse of lawn, the grass a vibrant green despite the overcast sky. Emily stopped, turning to face me. The light, soft and diffused, illuminated her face, highlighting the delicate contours of her features, the depth and vulnerability in her eyes. "You've always been there for me, Dad," she said, her voice quiet, almost a whisper, but carrying a weight that belied its softness. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Her words stopped me. The way she said them, the raw vulnerability in her voice, touched a deep primal part of me, a protective instinct that had been ingrained since the moment she was born. My heart ached with a sudden fierce tenderness. I wanted to reach out, to pull her close, to reassure her, to shield her from whatever pain or uncertainty she was carrying. Trying to lighten the mood, to defuse the sudden intensity of the moment, I forced a smile, a light, joking one. "Don't worry about it," I said, my voice a little too bright, a little too forced. "Dad's not going anywhere." But she didn't smile back. Her expression remained serious, her gaze locked on mine, unwavering. Instead of easing the tension, my attempt at levity seemed to amplify it. She stepped closer, her eyes searching mine with an unsettling intensity. "No," she said, her voice barely audible now, thick with emotion. "I mean, you're more than just a dad to me. You're everything to me." Continue to escalate the tension and emotional conflict, leading to the climax in the park. I froze. Her words hung in the air, heavy and charged, their meaning unmistakable. The lightheartedness I had desperately tried to maintain shattered, leaving me exposed, vulnerable to the raw emotion radiating from her. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, the familiar landscape of our father-daughter relationship tilting precariously, threatening to plunge into an abyss of the unknown and forbidden. "Emily," I whispered, my voice barely a breath, choked with a mixture of disbelief and rising panic. What are you saying?" I searched her face frantically, desperately seeking some sign of innocence, some indication that I had misinterpreted her words, that this was just an awkward, sentimental moment between father and daughter, exaggerated by my own overactive imagination. But there was nothing innocent in her eyes. They were wide, luminous with an emotion I couldn't name. An emotion that both drew me in and terrified me in equal measure. "You know Daddy loves you, right?" I stammered, my voice trembling slightly, resorting to the familiar endearment from her childhood, clinging to the vestiges of our past, hoping to somehow rewind time, to erase the dangerous path we seemed to be hurtling down. "But not like that. Not this way." "I know," she replied, her voice thick with unshed tears, emotion trembling on the edge of breaking. Her lower lip quivered slightly, and her eyes, glistening with moisture, held a desperate plea. a raw vulnerability that was both heartbreaking and intoxicating. I know it's not right. I know it shouldn't be like this. She paused, taking a shaky breath, her gaze never leaving mine. But I can't stop thinking about you, Daddy. The word daddy, once a sweet term of endearment, now sounded different, charged with a new, unsettling resonance. I try to push it out of my head, but it keeps coming back. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic drum against my ribs. My body felt rigid, frozen in place, caught in the headlights of an oncoming train. Unable to move, unable to escape. This wasn't how a father and daughter should talk, should look at each other. My mind screamed at me to back away, to create distance, to stop this before it spiraled completely out of control. But my body seemed locked in place, paralyzed by a conflicting mix of horror and a strange, terrifying curiosity. We should go back," I managed to stammer out, my voice shaking, barely audible. "It's getting late." Before I could turn away, before I could physically put distance between us, Emily reached out again, her hand trembling slightly as she gently took mine. This time the touch wasn't fleeting, wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, lingering, her fingers intertwining with mine. The touch itself was innocent, almost childlike in its gentleness, but the way her skin felt against mine, the delicate pressure of her fingers, sent another jolt of electricity through me, more potent this time, more undeniably seductive. My stomach clenched, a knot of nausea and unwanted desire twisting within me. This shouldn't feel like this. She shouldn't feel like this. "Dad," she said, her voice breaking, filled with an emotion I couldn't fully decipher, a complex mixture of longing, confusion, and hope. "I know this isn't right, but I can't control how I feel." Panic, cold and sharp, surged through me, drowning out everything else. I ripped my hand away from hers, recoiling as if her touch had burned me, stepping back, putting physical space between us, desperately trying to create a buffer against the overwhelming emotions threatening to engulf us both. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure terror. "Emily, we can't," I gasped, my voice ragged, barely recognizable. "This is wrong. You're my daughter. And we can't do this." She looked at me, her expression a heartbreaking mixture of confusion and hurt, her eyes widening with dawning realization. "I'm not confused, Dad," she said, her voice stronger now, firmer, laced with a desperate conviction. "I know how I feel." "No," I shouted, the denial tearing from my throat, raw and visceral. I shook my head violently, feeling the pain rise inside me, a searing ache that threatened to consume me. "No, this isn't right. You're my daughter, Emily. And we can't." The words choked in my throat, too heavy, too dangerous to voice aloud, too terrifying to acknowledge even to myself. Emily took another step towards me, closing the distance I had just desperately created, her eyes fixed on mine, pleading, searching, demanding something I wouldn't give her. And in that moment, facing the raw vulnerability and desperate longing in her gaze, I knew I had to do something, anything, to stop this, to end this conversation, to escape this park, this moment, before it went irrevocably too far. I had to protect us both, even if it meant inflicting pain, even if it meant shattering the fragile remnants of our once untroubled relationship. I needed to reestablish the boundary, to make it stark and undeniable, even if it broke both our hearts in the process. "We should go home," I said, my voice trembling but firm, trying to project a resolve I didn't fully feel. "This isn't right, Emily. We shouldn't be like this." Continue the story to the departure of Emily and immediate aftermath. Emily paused, her breath catching in her throat, her shoulders slumping slightly. She bowed her head, her gaze falling to the ground, the vibrant green grass suddenly seeming dull and lifeless beneath her feet. A single tear escaped her eye, tracing a glistening path down her cheek. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible, laced with a profound disappointment that pierced me to the core. "I didn't mean to embarrass you like this." Her apology, her self-blame, was like a knife twist in my gut. Embarrass me? This wasn't about embarrassment. This was about something far more profound, far more dangerous. It was about the shattering of a fundamental bond, the blurring of lines that should never be crossed. But explaining that, articulating the depth of my fear and anguish, felt impossible, too risky, too likely to reignite the very flames I was desperately trying to extinguish. I took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to regain control of my emotions, to project an air of calm and reassurance, even though my own heart was a chaotic storm of fear and guilt. "It's okay, baby," I said softly, using the familiar endearment again, the word feeling suddenly hollow, stripped of its innocent affection. "Even though," I continued, forcing myself to articulate the painful truth, "it's not okay. We just need to keep some distance. For a while." The drive home was a silent, agonizing ordeal. The air in the car was thick and heavy, suffocating. Neither of us spoke. The unspoken words hung between us like a suffocating fog, heavy with regret, confusion, and a profound sense of loss. I glanced at Emily a few times, catching glimpses of her profile in the periphery of my vision. Her gaze was fixed out the window, her expression unreadable, her body language radiating a deep withdrawal. The vibrant energy she had brought home with her just days before seemed to have been completely extinguished, replaced by a quiet, desolate stillness. Back at the house, the silence was even more oppressive, amplified by the familiar surroundings, the very rooms that had once echoed with laughter and easy affection now bearing witness to the raw, unspoken tension between us. We parked in the driveway and without a word, Emily got out of the car and walked directly to the front door. I followed her inside, my movements leaden, my spirit weighed down by a crushing sense of failure. Inside, neither of us spoke. It was as if the dam of silence had finally burst, releasing a flood of unspoken emotions that rendered words inadequate, pointless. Emily went straight to her room, closing the door behind her with a soft, final-sounding click. I stood in the living room alone, feeling utterly lost and adrift. I looked around the familiar space, the comfortable furniture, the family photos on the mantelpiece, the half-finished movie still paused on the television screen. All of it suddenly alien, imbued with a strange, unsettling quality. Everything was the same, and yet everything had irrevocably changed. The comfortable familiarity of our home had been tainted, poisoned by the unspoken, forbidden desires that had surfaced between us. The heaviness in my heart seemed to permeate the very walls of the house, making it feel colder, emptier, stranger than it ever had before. Part of me, a desperate, impulsive part, wanted to run upstairs, to knock on her door, to talk to Emily, to try to somehow explain, to apologize, to clear the air, to make things right again. But I knew with a cold, stark certainty that that would be the worst possible thing to do. Any attempt to reopen the conversation, to revisit the raw emotions we had just barely managed to contain, would only make things worse, would only deepen the wounds we had inflicted on each other, on our relationship. Distance. That was the only answer. Distance and silence. For now. I sank onto the sofa, the soft cushions offering no comfort, my mind racing, churning with a chaotic whirlwind of thoughts. Emily was my daughter. My beautiful, intelligent, complex daughter. How could we have arrived at this point? How could the innocent affection we shared have twisted into something so wrong? Memories of her childhood flooded back, vivid and bittersweet. Tiny Emily with pigtails and scraped knees, running through the house, laughing, chattering endlessly, demanding my attention, my love, my protection. And I had always been there for her. Her steadfast protector, her loving father. Now things were different. Emily was an adult, no longer that innocent little girl. But I was still her father. And my love for her, my protective instinct, should have remained purely paternal. It should have ended there. Where had I gone wrong? What had I done or failed to do to allow this deviation, this monstrous misunderstanding to take root and grow? That night, sleep remained a distant, unattainable dream. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the darkness amplifying the turmoil in my mind. Questions and fears circled endlessly, like vultures circling prey. What had made Emily feel this way? Was it my fault? Had I been too close, too affectionate? Had I somehow inadvertently sent the wrong signals, blurred the lines of our relationship in some subtle, unconscious way? I replayed countless moments in my mind, searching for clues, for answers, for any indication of where and when things had begun to go wrong. Our relationship, once so simple, so innocent, so defined, had become unimaginably, terrifyingly complicated. Continue to the morning departure and reflection on the broken relationship. The next morning I woke up feeling utterly exhausted, both physically and emotionally drained. The weight of the previous day's events pressed down on me, heavier than ever. I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that the passage of time, even just a few hours, would have somehow eased the intensity of the emotions, that the heavy cloud hanging over us would have dissipated. But instead, the tension seemed to have solidified, congealed into a palpable presence that permeated every corner of the house. Emily was gone when I came downstairs. Her bedroom door was closed, and the house was eerily silent. She had left without a word, without a sound. The air in the house was so thick with unspoken emotions, with unresolved conflict, that it felt physically difficult to breathe. I sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at my untouched coffee, the rich aroma doing nothing to penetrate the fog of my despair. After a while I heard footsteps on the stairs. Emily appeared in the doorway, dressed in jeans and a simple t-shirt, a small backpack slung over her shoulder. She was clearly packed, ready to leave. "I'm heading back to school," she said, her voice calm, almost detached, but I could detect a tremor of anxiety beneath the surface, a subtle vulnerability in her carefully constructed composure. I nodded, my throat tight, unable to speak. Words felt inadequate, useless in the face of the profound chasm that had opened between us. Maybe that's a good thing," I managed to stammer out, trying to keep my voice even neutral. We both need some space." She looked at me then, her eyes meeting mine for the first time that morning. Her gaze was sad, shadowed, holding a depth of unspoken emotion that mirrored my own internal turmoil. But she said nothing more. She simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement of her head. Without another word, she turned and walked to the front door. I followed her, my footsteps heavy, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. I stood in the doorway, watching as she walked to her car, her movements stiff and deliberate, her body language radiating a profound withdrawal. She opened the car door, placed her backpack on the passenger seat, and then turned back to face me one last time. Our eyes met again, holding a silent, painful exchange of unspoken emotions, regret, confusion, loss, and a desperate, unspoken yearning for things to be different. "Have a safe trip," I said, my voice catching in my throat, the words barely audible. She offered a faint, almost ghost-like smile, a fleeting shadow of the bright, vibrant daughter I knew. "Thanks, Dad," she whispered, the word hanging in the air between us, heavy with the weight of its now complicated meaning. Then she slipped into her car, closed the door, and started the engine. I stood there, motionless, watching as her car backed out of the driveway and disappeared down the familiar street, turning the corner and vanishing from sight. When she was gone, the house felt utterly empty, eerily silent, devoid of life. The whole place seemed to have lost a part of its soul, a vital spark extinguished. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I, too, had lost something irretrievably precious, something I would never get back. I knew that distance, physical separation, was necessary. It would give us both time to breathe, to reflect, to process the tangled emotions that had overwhelmed us. It would give us a chance, perhaps, to regain some semblance of perspective, to sort through the wreckage of our fractured relationship. But I couldn't deny the profound sense of loss that washed over me as I stood there in the doorway, watching the empty street where her car had disappeared. Things had gone too far. A line had been crossed, or at least irrevocably blurred. And I didn't know, couldn't even begin to imagine, if our relationship would ever be the same again. Continue to the weeks following and the final message, ending with the reflection and call to action. In the weeks that followed Emily's departure, I tried, desperately, to return to some semblance of normalcy. I went through the motions of my daily routine, work, meals, chores, attempting to fill the gaping void her absence had created with the mundane rhythms of everyday life. But nothing was the same. The house remained stubbornly, achingly quiet without her presence. Every room, every corner, echoed with her absence, a constant, painful reminder of what we had lost. And I couldn't stop thinking about her. Memories of that walk in the park, of her tear-filled eyes, of her whispered confession, kept swirling in my mind, replaying endlessly, tormenting me with their unresolved intensity. I wanted to believe that the distance would help, that time would ease the pain, that the raw, unsettling emotions would fade with time, becoming muted, manageable. But deep down, a cold, persistent voice whispered that once something fundamental had been broken, it could never truly be repaired. Something essential, something precious between Emily and I had been irrevocably fractured. And no matter how hard we tried, no matter how much time passed, we could never fully return to where we had been before. The innocence, the unquestioning trust, the easy affection, All of it felt tainted, shadowed by the unspoken desires and forbidden longings that had surfaced between us. One quiet weekend afternoon, weeks after Emily had returned to school, my phone buzzed with a text message notification. It was from her. My heart leaped in my chest, a mixture of hope and trepidation fluttering within me. I hesitated for a moment, my fingers hovering over the screen, almost afraid to open the message, afraid of what it might contain. Taking a deep breath, I finally unlocked my phone and read her words. She wrote that she was trying to work through things, that she understood that things weren't right, and that she too needed time to think, to process, to heal. The message was brief, impersonal, almost clinical in its detachment. But beneath the surface of the carefully chosen words, I could sense a flicker of something. Regret? Sadness? A faint glimmer of hope for reconciliation? It was hard to tell. I read each word slowly, deliberately, rereading the short message several times, searching for hidden meanings, for unspoken clues. A mixture of emotions washed over me. Sadness, undeniably. A deep, aching sadness for what we had lost, for the beautiful, uncomplicated relationship that had been shattered. But also a strange sense of relief. Relief that she, too, recognized the gravity of the situation, that she, too, understood that boundaries had been blurred, lines had been crossed, and that distance, time, and introspection were necessary for both of us. Emily needed time, she said. And so did I. Maybe with enough time, enough distance, enough introspection, we would eventually find a way to mend our broken relationship, to rebuild trust, to redefine our boundaries, to find a new way forward, a new kind of connection that could exist within the appropriate, healthy parameters of a father-daughter relationship. But maybe things would never be the same again. Maybe some wounds are too deep, some cracks too wide to ever fully heal. Maybe the best we could hope for was to find a way to coexist, to navigate the wreckage of our past, to build a new, albeit more distant and guarded future. I sighed a long, weary exhalation of breath and closed my phone, letting it fall onto the coffee table beside me. I walked to the window, looking out at the city sprawling in the distance. From here, from the quiet solitude of my living room, the city looked peaceful, serene under the afternoon sun. But in my heart there was no peace, only a deep, persistent ache, a lingering sense of loss, and a profound uncertainty about the future. Maybe only time would answer the questions that neither Emily nor I could face right now. Maybe only time would reveal if what had been broken could ever be mended. Reflection and call to action. My story, I realize now, is a stark lesson in the delicate, often precarious boundaries of family relationships. It's a cautionary tale about the subtle, insidious ways in which lines can blur, affection can morph into something dangerous, and the very foundations of our closest bonds can begin to crumble. As parents, as caregivers, as individuals navigating the complexities of human connection, we have a profound responsibility to nurture and love those close to us, unconditionally and wholeheartedly. But love, true love, must always be accompanied by respect, by understanding, and by the crucial recognition of necessary distance. There will be times in life, inevitably, when emotions become complicated, when relationships shift and evolve, when we feel lost, confused, unsure of the path forward. Especially as our children grow and change, as the dynamics within our families naturally transform. But it is in those moments of confusion, of ambiguity, that it becomes even more vital to remain sober, to maintain clarity, to actively, consciously set and enforce clear boundaries. Don't let emotions, however powerful or compelling they may seem, blur the lines of appropriate behavior, of healthy connection. Don't allow fleeting feelings or momentary lapses in judgment to erode the foundations of relationships that are meant to be sacred, protective, and fundamentally defined by their inherent roles: parent and child, sibling and sibling, friend and friend. Small moments, seemingly innocuous glances, casual touches, unspoken longings, can, if left unchecked, if ignored or rationalized away, become gaping cracks in the edifice of our relationships. And once those cracks appear, once those lines are crossed, they are excruciatingly difficult, sometimes impossible, to repair. The lesson I have learned, and the lesson I hope to impart by sharing this deeply personal and painful story, is to always be vigilant. To always be mindful of the delicate balance of closeness and distance. To always be acutely aware of what is right and wrong, appropriate and inappropriate. And perhaps most importantly, to know when to stop, when to step back, when to reestablish boundaries before things spiral too far, before irreparable damage is done. Respecting boundaries is not a sign of coldness or distance. It is, in fact, the only true way to protect the most important relationships in our lives, to ensure their health, their longevity, and their enduring strength. Thank you for listening to my story. It's been difficult to share, deeply personal and raw. If you found it resonated with you, if it offered you any insight, any food for thought, please consider giving this video a like. Share it with someone who might benefit from hearing it. And if you're interested in hearing more stories like this, stories about the complexities of human relationships, the challenges of family dynamics, and the sometimes treacherous path of navigating love and boundaries, please subscribe to my channel. And let me know in the comments below. Has anything like this ever happened to you? What are your thoughts on boundaries within families? Would you be interested in hearing more about what happened next with Emily and me? Let me know if you'd like me to share part 2 of this story. Your comments and your engagement mean a lot. Thank you for watching and for listening.